Madison Reed stepped through the revolving doors of a luxury hotel in a downpour, dragging a battered suitcase, her face worn thin from a red-eye flight. No one guessed the quiet single mother standing there was the true owner of the Meridian Grand. The desk staff smirked, the night manager looked her over from head to toe, then announced every room was full, though the screen behind him showed dozens of vacant suites. When Madison calmly asked him to check again, he called security instead. The moment the general manager's private phone rang across the lobby, the room went silent. The Meridian Grand rose above downtown Chicago like a monument to old money, its marble lobby polished to a mirror shine, its crystal chandeliers throwing soft gold light across every corner. A private elevator carried only the hotel's most valued guests to the presidential floor, where the windows framed the entire skyline as though the city itself had been arranged for their pleasure. It was the kind of building that made ordinary people lower their voices the moment they stepped inside, unsure whether they belonged. Madison Reed belonged there more than anyone realized, though almost no one in the building would have guessed it. She was the true owner of the Meridian Grand, holding her stake through a parent company that kept her name off every plaque and every press release. Madison had built her fortune quietly, and she preferred it that way. She avoided cameras, avoided galas, avoided the version of success that required constant performance. Most of the staff on the lower floors had never once seen her face. Long before she owned hotels, Madison had worked inside them. She had scrubbed bathroom tile until her knuckles cracked, carried trays through crowded banquet halls, and stood behind a front desk on the overnight shift, absorbing the impatience of travelers who assumed she was beneath their notice. She remembered exactly what it felt like to be dismissed by someone holding a clipboard and a title, and she had promised herself that if she ever built something of her own, no employee of hers would make a guest feel small because of what they wore or how tired they looked. For weeks, quiet complaints had been reaching the parent company through an anonymous feedback pathway meant for exactly this purpose. Guests described being turned away despite confirmed reservations, charged strange fees that never appeared on any receipt, and watched as staff fawned over wealthier arrivals while everyone else waited. Something at the Meridian Grand had gone wrong beneath its polished surface, and Madison decided the only way to understand it was to walk through the front doors as an ordinary traveler, unannounced and unrecognized. She dressed the part deliberately, a gray coat gone soft at the seams, a suitcase with a broken wheel she never bothered to fix, no jewelry, no assistant trailing behind her. She wanted to know without any doubt how her own hotel would treat a tired woman traveling alone in the middle of the night. She thought briefly of her daughter, Hannah, asleep at home under the watch of her mother, Evelyn. That thought steadied her the way it always did, a small anchor before she walked into whatever the night had waiting for her. Inside the hotel, two names controlled almost everything that happened after midnight. Logan Price, the night manager, moved through the lobby like a man who believed politeness was a currency reserved only for guests who looked like they could afford it. Charlotte Hayes, the head of the front desk, worked beside him with a colder, sharper version of the same instinct, deciding within seconds whether a guest deserved warmth or dismissal. Together they had built an unspoken rule that governed the overnight hours. Guests in tailored coats received smiles and upgrades, while guests who looked ordinary were pushed toward the door or quietly charged fees that existed nowhere in any official policy. A newer employee named Mason Carter had recently transferred down from internal finance to audit the hotel's overnight numbers. He had already noticed strange patterns in the reservation system, bookings that didn't match the revenue reports, discrepancies too small to prove anything on their own but too consistent to ignore. He didn't yet have enough evidence to raise an alarm, but the unease had been building in him for days. Madison was not walking into the Meridian Grand that night simply to rest after a long flight. She was walking in to find whoever had been quietly poisoning the reputation of a hotel she had once pulled back from the edge of financial ruin, and she intended to see it with her own eyes before she decided what to do about it. The rain had not let up since Madison's taxi pulled away, and it was falling hard by the time she stepped out beneath the hotel's stone awning near midnight. The doorman glanced at her for less than a second before turning his full attention to a group of guests climbing out of a black car in designer coats. hurrying to shield them from the weather while Madison stood alone in the drizzle, gripping the handle of a suitcase that no longer rolled evenly. She said nothing about it. She simply pulled the case across the wet floor of the lobby herself, taking in every detail as she walked. The carpet near the entrance was soaked and had clearly not been attended to in some time. A cluster of staff stood near a side hallway, talking among themselves instead of watching the floor. Ordinary guests waited near the desk, while a wealthier party was ushered ahead of them without apology. Charlotte Hayes looked up as Madison approached, and her eyes performed a quick, practiced sweep from the frayed coat to the broken suitcase wheel. When Madison said she had a reservation waiting, Charlotte didn't check the details closely. Instead, she asked, in a voice edged with doubt, whether Madison was certain she had the right hotel. Madison handed over her confirmation number without a word. Charlotte typed for a moment, deliberately skimming past the details in front of her, then announced that the reservation had been canceled because the card on file was invalid. Madison asked why, since the card attached to the booking was a valid corporate account used for dozens of reservations before. Charlotte offered a thin smile and said the hotel simply couldn't hold rooms for guests who didn't meet a certain standard. Behind Charlotte, reflected faintly in the dark glass panel along the wall, Madison could see the booking screen still showing a long column of open rooms. She asked evenly whether there might be anything else available. Logan Price appeared then, adjusting his tie, sizing Madison up the same way Charlotte had. His voice was polished and hollow at once as he informed her that the hotel was completely full for the night. Only a minute later, a well-dressed couple walked in without any reservation at all. Logan immediately ordered one of the finest rooms open for them, his tone shifting into warm, eager hospitality. Madison watched in silence, filing away every detail of what she had just seen. Near the audit desk, Mason Carter stood close enough to witness the contradiction firsthand. The system in front of him still showed vacancies exactly where Logan claimed there were none. Before turning to walk away, Madison asked one last question, her voice calm and unhurried. She wondered aloud whether the hotel had an official policy of refusing guests based on their clothing. Logan's practiced smile disappeared for the first time that night. Water dripped steadily from the hem of her coat onto the marble floor, forming a small dark pool that no one rushed to notice. Madison remained still, watching the rhythm of the lobby the way she once studied every hotel she had ever worked in, searching for the small cracks beneath the surface that told the real story of a place. She noticed how quickly staff straightened their posture for guests in tailored suits, and how easily their attention slid away from anyone dressed more plainly. A bellhop passed close enough to offer help with luggage to the wealthier group, but walked past Madison without a second glance, as though she were simply part of the scenery. She let it pass without remark, filing the moment away with the rest of what she was gathering that night. Logan recovered quickly, reaching for the language of policy the way other men reached for a weapon. He told Madison the reservation had never been guaranteed, that certain cards required additional verification, and that the hotel reserved the right to refuse service at its own discretion. Each phrase sounded rehearsed, as though he had used the same script on other guests many times before. Charlotte spoke loudly enough for several nearby guests to hear, remarking that a five-star hotel wasn't the right place for someone who couldn't afford to stay there. A few heads turned. The air in the lobby thickened with quiet embarrassment, though Madison's expression never changed. She asked to speak with the general manager or with anyone holding higher authority than Logan. He told her flatly that no one above him was present that night. Hunter Blake, the head of security, was called over next. He didn't ask what had happened. He simply listened as Logan described Madison as a guest who was causing a disturbance, and he accepted the description without question. Madison stated clearly that she had a valid reservation, proper identification, and a working payment card, and that she had not raised her voice once. Hunter hesitated for a moment, but ultimately positioned himself beside Logan rather than beside the truth nearby. Mason quietly pulled up the reservation on a secondary terminal and discovered that Madison's booking had never actually been canceled by any system error. It had been manually switched to a no-show status by Charlotte only minutes earlier. He wanted to speak up immediately, but he knew Logan's history. Two employees before him had lost their jobs simply for questioning how guests were treated at the front desk. Then Logan offered a condition dressed up as generosity. If Madison wanted to stay, she would need to pay a special verification fee in cash, a charge that existed nowhere in the hotel's official system. Madison understood in that instant that this was no longer simple rudeness. It was organized, deliberate fraud dressed in the language of hospitality policy. She asked whether that fee could be provided to her in writing. Logan's patience snapped, and he told her sharply that she wasn't in a position to be asking questions. Charlotte added, almost cheerfully, that Madison might have better luck finding a cheaper motel a few streets south of downtown. Madison lifted her eyes toward the hotel's polished brass emblem mounted above the entrance, where the words engraved beneath it promised warmth, welcome, and hospitality to every guest who walked through the door. Standing there in the cold light of the lobby, she understood with sudden clarity that the hotel bearing her name was betraying the very principles she had built it to protect. A young couple nearby exchanged an uneasy glance, clearly uncomfortable witnessing the exchange but unwilling to intervene. Madison noticed their discomfort and understood it well. Speaking up against a hotel employee in a strange city was never an easy thing to do, even for people who knew an injustice when they saw it. Charlotte's tone grew sharper with every passing minute, as though Madison's calm composure only irritated her further. She seemed to expect tears or anger, or some kind of collapse that would justify the way she was being treated. Instead, Madison simply continued asking careful, precise questions, each one landing with more weight than any outburst could have carried. Logan glanced toward the elevator bank more than once, clearly hoping no one from upstairs would choose that particular hour to appear. He had grown comfortable believing that the overnight shift belonged entirely to him, free from oversight, free from consequence. Mason approached the front desk under the pretense of needing a signature for his overnight audit report, though his real reason was to get a closer look at Madison's reservation file. When he glanced at the name, Madison Reed, something in his memory stirred. He had seen that name once before, buried in a stack of ownership documents he wasn't meant to study too closely. But the true owner of the parent company rarely appeared in public, so he couldn't be certain. He asked Charlotte directly why she had switched the booking to a no-show status while the guest, attached to it, was standing right in front of her. Charlotte told him coldly to stay out of matters that weren't his concern. Logan pulled Mason aside a moment later and reminded him in a low warning tone that his job was to audit numbers, not to lecture the front desk on how to treat guests. Madison had already noticed Mason. There was something different about him compared to everyone else behind that desk. He looked tense, uncertain even, but not dishonest. She offered to settle the bill immediately with her card, hoping to end the confrontation cleanly. Charlotte refused, claiming the system couldn't process that particular type of card. Mason knew that wasn't true. He had used the same payment system an hour earlier without any issue. Madison asked for a written record explaining why she was being refused service. Logan laughed under his breath and told her that guests who were turned away had no right to demand internal paperwork. Hunter stepped closer, resting a hand near his radio. Applying quiet pressure meant to push Madison toward the exit without another word. Still, Madison didn't reveal who she was. She wanted to hear, without any disguise, exactly what these employees truly believed about the people they served. Logan said something that would later prove to be the most damaging sentence of his career. He told her plainly that the hotel existed for people of real standing, not for someone dragging a broken suitcase through the lobby after midnight demanding respect she hadn't earned. Mason heard every word. Without drawing attention to himself, he quietly triggered a backup of the lobby's security footage through his audit terminal, making certain the recording couldn't be erased later. Before walking away, Madison asked Logan for his full name and title. He answered with total confidence, unaware that his own words were about to become the evidence that ended his career. Charlotte busied herself with paperwork that didn't need attention, avoiding Mason's eyes as he lingered near the desk. She had grown used to Logan covering for her, and she assumed this night would be no different from any other. Madison studied Mason carefully while he worked, noting the way his hands moved with quiet precision even while his shoulders remained tense. She had spent enough years around dishonest employees to recognize the difference between someone protecting themselves and someone quietly trying to do what was right despite the risk. A guest near the seating area lowered a newspaper just enough to watch the unfolding scene, curious but careful not to get involved. The lobby had become a stage without anyone quite realizing it, and every person within it was choosing, whether they meant to or not, which side of the moment they wanted to stand on. Hunter's grip on his radio tightened as the silence stretched longer than he expected. He had removed guests before, but never one who spoke with such unshaken calm, and something about that steadiness unsettled him more than any argument could have. Mason kept digging through the audit terminal and found something far larger than one canceled reservation. Several premium suites had been marked under maintenance in the main system, yet the same rooms had clearly been sold off the books, paid for in cash or through private transfers that never touched the hotel's official ledger. Logan and Charlotte had quietly built a small operation inside the hotel itself, holding the best rooms for wealthier guests, collecting private fees on the side, and pushing legitimate guests out whenever it suited them. Madison kept playing the part of an ordinary traveler, asking why the presidential suite had just been opened for a guest with no reservation while she was being told the hotel was completely full. Charlotte answered that the other guest was a high-tier member. Madison asked whether high-tier membership gave someone the right to take a room that belonged to another guest entirely. Logan's composure began to crack. He told Madison she was disturbing guests who actually mattered to the hotel. An older woman seated nearby, Grace Miller, spoke up gently, mentioning that she too had been charged an unusual fee when she checked in earlier that week. Charlotte shot her a sharp look meant to silence her. Madison absorbed the detail quietly. She was no longer the only person who had been taken advantage of that night. Hunter received an order to remove Madison from the lobby entirely. Mason stepped forward before it could happen, reminding Hunter that hotel procedure didn't allow security to remove a guest holding a valid reservation without a formal incident report first. Logan turned on Mason immediately, asking sharply whether he wanted to lose his job over this. Madison looked at Mason and understood in that moment that he had chosen to stand on the side of the truth without knowing anything about who she really was. Furious, Logan instructed Charlotte to permanently cancel Madison's reservation and mark her file with a note describing her as hostile and difficult. Mason quietly recorded the exact timestamp of that action, adding it to the evidence already building on his terminal. Rather than raise her voice or threaten anyone, Madison reached for her phone. She didn't call the police, and she didn't call a reporter. She dialed an internal number known only to the highest level of leadership within the Meridian, Grand's parent company. Madison thought of every ordinary traveler who might have walked through those doors over the past several months, tired from a long trip, expecting nothing more than the room they had already paid for, only to be met with condescension dressed up as policy. The thought hardened something inside her, though her face remained calm. Charlotte tried once more to intimidate Grace Miller into silence, suggesting quietly that guests who caused trouble sometimes found their future reservations mysteriously unavailable. Grace didn't back down, though her voice trembled slightly as she spoke. Mason kept working at his terminal, cross-referencing timestamps and transaction codes, building a picture far larger than a single canceled reservation. Each new discovery deepened his understanding of just how long this scheme had been running beneath the surface of the hotel's polished reputation. Logan watched Madison dial her phone with a flicker of unease he couldn't quite explain. Something about her composure didn't match the profile of a guest he could simply wait out until she gave up and left. The call connected to Elijah Brooks, the chief executive of the hotel group operating under Madison's parent company. He was upstairs on the executive floor preparing for an early morning meeting, completely unaware that Madison had arrived hours earlier than expected and was standing in her own lobby being turned away. Madison kept her voice steady and brief. She told him only that she was standing in the lobby of the Meridian Grand, that she had been refused a valid room, pressured for an unofficial fee, and was about to be escorted out by security. Elijah went silent for a few seconds before ordering every member of the executive team to come down to the lobby immediately. Logan had no idea who Madison had just called. He mocked her lightly, saying she could phone whoever she wanted, but no outside call was going to change the rules he enforced during his shift. Madison put her phone away and waited without another word. Charlotte leaned toward Logan and whispered that they should get rid of Madison quickly before the situation drew any more attention. Hunter stepped forward and told Madison it was time for her to leave the property. Madison replied calmly that she would go, but only if he was willing to sign a written statement confirming that the hotel had removed a guest holding a valid reservation. Hunter froze. He clearly did not want that kind of record attached to his name. Moments later, the private elevator opened. Elijah Brooks walked out first, followed by legal counsel Abigail Moore and Human Resources Director Eleanor Scott. The mood of the lobby shifted instantly. Logan straightened his jacket out of instinct, and Charlotte's face went pale the moment she realized these particular executives never came downstairs at midnight unless something serious had happened. Elijah walked straight toward Madison and addressed her respectfully as Miss Reed. The lobby went completely silent. Logan stood frozen where he was. Charlotte's pen slipped from her fingers and clattered against the desk. Hunter took a small step backward. Madison didn't raise her voice or make a scene. She simply asked Elijah whether the hotel had an official policy of turning away a woman traveling alone in the rain because of an old coat. Elijah answered immediately that it did not, and he apologized to her right there in front of the entire lobby. Logan tried to salvage the moment, insisting it had all been a misunderstanding and that Madison hadn't properly identified herself when she arrived. Madison replied that an ordinary guest should never need to be a hotel's owner in order to deserve basic respect. She ended the exchange by requesting that the security footage, the system logs, and every recent room transaction be pulled and reviewed immediately. Abigail Moore's expression remained carefully neutral as she surveyed the lobby, her attention already shifting toward the practical matter of documentation and liability. Eleanor Scott, standing beside her, watched the staff's reactions closely, reading guilt in the way Charlotte refused to meet anyone's eyes. Grace Miller sat quietly nearby, watching the sudden arrival of executives with growing curiosity. She hadn't expected her small complaint to become part of something so much larger, but she felt a quiet satisfaction in finally being heard. Elijah turned to Madison and asked, gently, whether she wanted this handled privately or in front of the staff who had wronged her. Madison answered without hesitation that everything happening tonight would happen here, in the open, exactly where the disrespect had taken place. The other guests, scattered through the lobby, watched with a mixture of confusion and fascination, sensing that something significant was unfolding, but not yet understanding the full shape of it. Word would eventually spread among them, though Madison had no intention of turning the moment into spectacle for its own sake. Logan's jaw tightened as he realized the woman he had dismissed only minutes earlier held more authority over his career than anyone else in the building. Mason was asked to present everything he had gathered that night. His hands felt unsteady at first, especially with Logan glaring at him from across the lobby, but Madison told him quietly that all he needed to do was tell the truth. He laid out the system log, showing exactly when Madison's reservation had been switched to a no-show status, only moments after she arrived at the counter. He also presented the list of premium suites that had been falsely marked under maintenance for weeks while being quietly sold outside the official system. Abigail Moore, the legal counsel, confirmed almost immediately that this went far beyond a simple procedural mistake. It carried every sign of deliberate financial fraud. Eleanor Scott asked Charlotte to explain the special verification fee. Charlotte claimed it was a misunderstanding, but she couldn't point to a single policy that supported it. Logan attempted to shift the blame entirely onto Charlotte, claiming he had only acted on information the front desk provided him. Charlotte fired back instantly, insisting that Logan was the one who had directed the off-book room sales to preferred guests all along. Hunter was questioned as well, asked why he never verified the reservation before attempting to remove Madison from the property. He admitted he had simply followed Logan's instructions without checking anything himself. The lobby security footage was pulled up on a nearby screen. Every dismissive remark, every condescending glance, every quiet manipulation of the booking system appeared in plain view for everyone to see. Grace Miller and two other guests came forward, confirming that they too had been charged fees that never appeared anywhere in the official system. Madison asked for a full review of the past 3 months of transactions, Elijah realized, with a sinking feeling that this problem likely extended far beyond a single overnight shift. Panic crept into Logan's voice as he asked to speak with Madison privately. She refused. What he had done in public would be answered in public in the same lobby where it had happened. She looked directly at Logan and told him that personnel decisions would be made right there, in front of everyone he had once treated with contempt. Elijah listened to every exchange with a tightening sense of responsibility, aware that this failure had happened under an organizational structure he was ultimately accountable for. He said little during the presentation, choosing instead to let the evidence speak plainly for itself. Mason continued through his findings methodically, pulling up a spreadsheet that traced the discrepancy in premium suite revenue across the past several weeks. The pattern was unmistakable once laid out in full. A steady bleed of money disguised behind maintenance notices and false discount codes. Charlotte's composure finally broke as the weight of the evidence became impossible to argue against. She insisted repeatedly that she had only been following instructions. Though no one in the room seemed convinced, Logan's earlier confidence had drained away entirely, replaced by the restless energy of a man searching for an exit that no longer existed. He glanced toward the doors more than once, though security now stood between him and any easy departure. Abigail Moore made a note to flag the falsified maintenance records for further legal review, recognizing that the scope of the fraud likely extended beyond what a single night's investigation could fully uncover. Eleanor Scott read through the violations quickly and clearly: discrimination against guests, falsified reservation records, unauthorized fees, abuse of managerial authority, and intimidation of an employee who had tried to do the right thing. Logan's employment was terminated on the spot. His staff badge was deactivated before he even had time to respond. Charlotte was dismissed shortly after, once the data confirmed she had personally canceled the reservation, falsified the guest notes, and coordinated the collection of unauthorized fees. Hunter wasn't fired in the heat of the moment, but he was suspended immediately for the misuse of his security authority. Once additional evidence showed he had known something was wrong and acted anyway, Madison authorized Human Resources to move forward with an emergency termination process. Madison made it clear to everyone watching that this wasn't personal revenge. It was about protecting every guest who had ever been dismissed simply because they lacked the power to defend themselves. Logan tried one last appeal, reminding Madison that he had worked at the hotel for 7 years. She told him that 7 years was far too long to have spent learning how to hurt the very guests he was meant to serve. Charlotte broke down, insisting that Madison didn't understand the pressures of the hospitality industry. Madison replied quietly that she understood it better than anyone in that room, because she had once stood behind a front desk earning far less than Charlotte ever had. Mason was asked to temporarily help lock down the reservation system and preserve every piece of relevant data. The remaining staff in the lobby stood in uneasy silence, caught somewhere between fear and shame. Madison announced that every guest who had been improperly charged would be fully refunded, and that a direct complaint line would be established immediately for anyone with concerns going forward. The scene closed with Logan being escorted out through the same glass doors where, only minutes earlier, he had tried to send Madison out into the storm. The remaining desk staff watched the proceedings with a mixture of fear and quiet relief, aware that they had spent months following rules set by two people who had clearly abused their positions. A few exchanged glances that suggested they had long suspected something was wrong but never felt safe enough to say so. Eleanor Scott moved efficiently through the termination paperwork, her manner professional rather than triumphant. She had handled difficult personnel matters before, but rarely with this much documented evidence stacked so clearly against the people involved. Grace Miller watched Logan's back activate with a small, satisfied nod, though she said nothing aloud. She had come to the hotel expecting nothing more than a quiet weekend away, not the unraveling of a scheme that had likely cost dozens of guests money they were never meant to lose. Madison addressed the remaining staff briefly before the lobby cleared, telling them plainly that the hotel's new standards would apply to everyone, regardless of position or seniority. No one, she said, was above treating a guest with basic decency. Charlotte's final words as she was escorted out were an accusation that Madison had orchestrated the entire evening as some kind of trap. Madison replied simply that the only thing she had done was walk through the front door as herself. The firings in the lobby were only the beginning. Madison ordered a full audit of every department at the Meridian Grand, determined to understand exactly how deep the corruption had spread. Mason was brought into the executive office to lay out every irregularity he had noticed over the past several weeks. He revealed that certain nights showed real room revenue significantly higher than what appeared in the official reports, with the difference quietly absorbed through fake discount codes that were never approved by anyone above Logan. Madison realized the hotel wasn't suffering from a single bad attitude problem. A small internal system had been slowly eating away at the business from within, hidden behind polished floors and glowing reviews from wealthier guests. Elijah admitted that the executive team had trusted Logan's clean reports for too long, ignoring complaints from ordinary travelers because the numbers on paper always looked strong. Madison insisted the hotel change how it measured success entirely, shifting focus away from premium suite revenue alone and toward the experience of every guest who walked through the doors, regardless of what they were wearing. Grace Miller was offered a complimentary stay in one of the finer rooms as a formal gesture of apology. Madison declined to take the presidential suite for herself. Instead, she checked into the very room she had originally booked, a quiet statement that every valid reservation deserved to be honored, without exception. Mason was given formal responsibility for protecting the audit data going forward, a turning point in his career that he hadn't expected when the night began. At one point, Madison received a short call from her mother, Evelyn. She asked only whether Hannah had fallen asleep yet, then let out a small breath of relief before returning her attention to the work in front of her. Standing outside the door of her simple, ordinary room, Madison understood that the night had done more than restore her own dignity. It had begun to save the soul of the hotel itself. The finance team spent the following days combing through months of transaction history, cross-referencing every discount code against approved records. What emerged was a pattern far more organized than a few isolated incidents, suggesting Logan had refined his methods carefully over a long stretch of time before Mason ever arrived to audit the property. Eleanor Scott began interviewing staff individually, trying to understand how widely the culture of fear had spread beneath Logan's management. Several employees admitted they had once tried to report irregular charges to him directly, only to be told the matter had already been handled. Madison requested that every department head submit a full review of their own procedures, not as punishment but as a genuine effort to rebuild trust from the ground up. She wanted the hotel's culture to change permanently, not simply survive one uncomfortable night of reckoning. Mason found himself working long hours in the weeks that followed, but he didn't mind the exhaustion. For the first time since transferring into his role, he felt as though his work actually mattered to the people the hotel was meant to serve. Elijah requested regular meetings with Madison going forward, determined to rebuild the trust her family's investment deserved. Madison agreed, though she made clear that trust, once broken, would need to be earned back slowly and consistently. The next morning, Madison called every member of staff into the hotel's largest conference room for a meeting that no one had been warned about in advance. She didn't open with authority or threats. Instead, she spoke briefly about her own early years working inside hotels, describing how a single moment of contempt from a supervisor could make an employee or a guest feel completely invisible. Madison told the room plainly that the Meridian Grand would no longer be a place that bowed to wealth while turning its back on anyone who seemed less fortunate. New policies were announced immediately. Unauthorized fees were banned outright. Any refusal of service now required a written incident report. Employees who reported wrongdoing would be protected rather than punished. Premium suites would undergo a full audit every week going forward. Staff members who had stayed silent under Logan's leadership were encouraged to speak honestly about what they had witnessed. Several admitted they had been too afraid of him to say anything. Madison chose not to punish those who had stayed quiet out of fear, but she made clear that silence was no longer acceptable starting that day. Mason was promoted to interim supervisor of operational auditing, not because he had helped Madison personally, but because he had defended the truth before he even knew who she was. Elijah apologized to Madison directly for allowing the hotel's culture to decay under his watch. Madison gave him a chance to correct it, but placed him under a strict period of review. Grace Miller received a formal letter of apology along with a complete refund of the fees she had been improperly charged. Word of what happened spread quietly among the staff, but Madison had no interest in turning it into a media spectacle. She wanted it to become a genuine reform, not a headline. The scene closed with Madison walking back through the lobby. This time, staff opened the door and greeted her with real respect. She didn't smile because of the power she held. She smiled because the guest walking in behind her received the very same welcome. Several employees approached Madison privately after the meeting, thanking her quietly for finally addressing a culture they had felt powerless to change on their own. One young front desk clerk admitted she had considered quitting entirely before that morning, believing nothing would ever improve. Madison spent the following hour walking through every department of the hotel, from housekeeping to the kitchen to the concierge desk, listening far more than she spoke. She wanted to understand the daily reality of every employee, not simply issue directives from a boardroom she rarely occupied. Mason found himself fielding questions from coworker, curious about what exactly had happened night before. He kept his answers simple, explaining only that dishonesty had finally been held accountable, and that the hotel intended to do better going forward. Elijah stood at the back of the conference room during Madison's address, watching her speak with a mixture of admiration and quiet humility. He understood now that leadership required more than trusting clean numbers on a report. It required actually walking the floors and listening to the people who kept the business running. By the time the meeting ended, a noticeably different energy had settled over the staff, something closer to relief than fear, as though a long-held tension had finally been allowed to release. Several weeks later, the Meridian Grand looked and felt like a different hotel entirely. Guest ratings climbed steadily, complaints dropped sharply, and every frontline employee completed new training centered on genuine hospitality and basic decency. Madison visited again, dressed just as simply as before, traveling alone once more. This time, no one needed to know who she was in order to treat her with kindness. Mason presented the final results of the audit. Most of the missing funds had been traced successfully. Several files had been handed over to the legal team, and the guests who had been affected were well on their way to being fully compensated. Madison thanked Mason for choosing not to stay silent. He answered simply that he had only done what the hotel should have been doing from the very beginning. In the final quiet moment, Madison stood in the lobby and watched an ordinary guest checked in with a warm, genuine smile from the staff at the desk. She understood that the true victory of that night was never about firing Logan Charlotte or Hunter. It was about turning the Meridian Grand into a place where no one would ever again be judged by the coat they wore, the suitcase they carried, or the amount of money in their account, the deepest kind of power. Madison had come to understand long before that rainy night was never about making people afraid. It was about protecting the very people who had once been overlooked and dismissed. Grace Miller became something of a regular guest after that, often stopping by the front desk simply to greet the staff who now remembered her by name rather than by the size of her bill. She liked to say the hotel finally felt like a place built for people, not just for appearances. Mason eventually moved into a permanent role overseeing operational integrity across the wider hotel group, a path he never expected when he first transferred out of a quiet finance office months earlier. He often thought back to that rainy night as the moment his career and his sense of purpose truly began. As for Madison, she returned to her ordinary routine, still avoiding cameras, still preferring quiet mornings over public recognition. But something in her had settled that night, a confirmation that the hotel she had built from nothing now reflected the values she had carried with her since her earliest days behind a front desk of her own. If you love a powerful hotel reversal story where truth finally wins, stay with this one until the very end.